right, good evening. It's about time for us to get started, and it is good to see you. We're turning our Bibles to the book of Leviticus, and invite you to turn with us there and study with us for a little while tonight. We are approaching Leviticus, at least these chapters, in an overview sort of way, so we won't have time to say everything specifically that we could say about that, but certainly if you have questions or if there's something that we don't say that you think should be pointed out, please feel free to do that. We're just going to kind of get a survey, bird's eye view of it, and as is profitable, we'll be happy to entertain any questions or make whatever other comments there are. As far as by way of introduction to the book of Leviticus, the book of Leviticus is written from the time right after the setting up of the tabernacle and all of those, the furniture that's made. But the name of the book, Leviticus, is actually the Greek name for the book when it was translated into our Greek Old Testaments, which is called the Septuagint. And what word do you see in Leviticus that might give you a clue about its content? You see Levi, that's right. Now, a lot of the book really doesn't have directly to do just with the Levites. I would say if we were going to give it another name, we might say relating to the priests. Or maybe we would say how to be holy as God is holy. And that is really the content of the book is holiness. And I really think that the book does, well, that's not ideal. I really do think the book does split up into two halves. The first half, if we need to not use this, that'd be all right. Just looking, not great. Yeah, thank you. There we go. Maybe that'll work. There we go. I do think the book splits up into two halves. Chapters 1 through 16, how to approach a holy God. And mostly that will have to do with the priests, the sacrifices, the rituals that have to do with approaching the tabernacle, and then also the Day of Atonement in chapter 16. And then the second half of the book, I think, relates more to your ordinary Israelite. So the Israelites, the ordinary Israelites, would have a role in the sacrifices, right? They would bring the burnt offering and they would bring the sin offering, but they're not doing the lion's share of the work in that. But just because they're not the ones approaching the tabernacle doesn't mean that they don't need to be aware about what it looks like to live in holiness. And so how do you live before a holy God? Well, chapter 17 through 27 speaks to that. And that's where we get a lot of the moral instruction in the book of Leviticus, and instructions about the feast days that all Israel was to observe, and instructions about the vows that all Israelites may or may not make. And so you kind of have the book split in these two sections. One outline that I like parallels that. You have rituals, right? You have the priestly rituals in chapters 1 through 7, but then you have kind of the people's rituals. This would be like feast days and things like that at the end of the book. Then you've got the priests in 8 through 10. Well, there's more instruction about the priests in 21 and 22. You've got purity. That would be like ritual purity. How do we know who can approach the tabernacle and who can't? And then you've got moral purity in 17 through 20. Avoiding sexual sin, avoiding idolatry, things like that. But right at the heart of it all, and I think this is the way the book of Leviticus is designed, right at the heart of it all is the Day of Atonement. And so I don't know if we'll get to the Day of Atonement tonight or not, but really I think that is the key feast of the book of Leviticus and really of the Jewish life. Mr. Dwight, anything by way of introduction? No. Okay. So I think we're ready for chapter 1. Chapter 1 basically covers the burnt offerings. And however much of that you want to read or talk about, that'd be great. We didn't prep for this, so I don't know. I mean, we prepped. We just didn't prep together. So
well,
just tell me how you want to go about this.
You go ahead and get started. I really didn't go back that far.
Yeah.
I was picking up where we left off.
Oh, I see. Yes.
And we.
Yeah, I got you.
But go ahead and talk about the burnt.
Well, let me just survey it like this then. We won't go into the details about all these. We have talked about the burnt offerings, and those things that were associated with the priests. We have not looked at them in much detail about what was done in each one. But I will say that the burnt offering, the word offering in Hebrew is something like korban or korban. So do you remember in the New Testament when the Pharisees were not giving the money to their parents as they ought to have? They would say it's korban. That's the word they're using. It's offered to God. So when you see the word burnt offering, it's the burnt korban. And this is the sacrifice. There was no part of this except the skin that would be theirs. They wouldn't get any of the meat. It would all burn on the altar to God. And this a demonstration of their completely being dedicated to God. You also have the grain offering. And the grain offering was generally it was in response to the gracious God. All of these are very less than that peace offering. Peace offering we offered either at the end of a vow or something like that. So when Hannah takes Samuel to the temple, she offered a peace offering at that time. And I think basically the idea is I'm finishing this vow out of my own free volition. Right? This is not something I felt like I did out of obligation. It's just I'm doing it because I want to please God, basically. So I was going to say something just a second ago. You remember what it was? Me neither. All right. So all three of these, all three of these are said to be a pleasing aroma to God. That language is used in the New Testament. But when it's used in the New Testament, it's used to talk about the financial contributions that we make to the work of God or the lives that we live that are honoring to God. And so I think these are a picture of the kind of sacrifices that we make as Christians. We offer ourselves to God. We give it to Him voluntarily. All three of these are voluntary offerings. A sin offering was not voluntary. A guilt offering was not voluntary. You had to do those because you had been caught or you had committed some trespass. These are occasions where you want to come to God and you want to say, I'm completely dedicated to you. Or I want to be in a good relationship with you. And you would come and you would offer these sacrifices. So the burnt one was the only one that was completely consumed. The grain offering was the only one that was non-meat. And the peace offering was the only one that the offering that the worshiper ate a part of it. Let me just briefly mention the sin offering. We did talk about this some bit with the priests. There was a difference between the sin offering of the priest and the congregation and then the sin offering of the individual. But whenever somebody sinned, and we don't have to turn to all those passages, whenever somebody sinned, they would bring these offerings to God, and the text tells us that they were forgiven, that God would atone for them. And we talked about the word covering or atonement there, that God would count this animal as having died on the worshiper's behalf. And they were forgiven. Now, I have questions about that. How is it that they were forgiven under the old law? A passage that has been helpful to me is in Romans chapter 3 and verses 25 and 26, where it says that Jesus came and died as a propitiation so that God could be just, basically, is how it describes it there, that He could be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. And He says to show His righteousness having passed over sins that were previously committed. Basically, how I understand that is this, that when they brought these sacrifices in faith, in sincerity, that God said, you are forgiven on the basis of the fact that one day Jesus was going to come and pay the price. And so that when Jesus died, yes, it made provision for our sins. But it was also by His blood that people under the old law were forgiven. Because the blood of bulls and goats was insufficient to actually pay the price of sin. God forgave their sin, but in view of the fact that Jesus was going to come and do what He was going to do. Sometimes we've used the language of rolled forward, right? When we use that phrase, I don't want us to think that somehow these sins are accruing somewhere. I think God forgave them. I think He forgot about them. Micah will talk about who is a God like you, who forgives sin, who treads them down and throws them into the sea. They're gone. but it was on the basis of the blood of Christ. And I think that a conscientious Jew would have recognized these are not enough for me to really be forgiven. That lamb is not worth the same. I mean, how many lambs is one human worth? An infinite number, right? I would take 1 billion lambs for one person. So I think even a conscientious Jew would know that this is not the same as me paying for my sin. But by God's grace, He allowed that to be satisfactory until Jesus came. And then there was a guilt offering. And the guilt offering was when you committed a sin that cost somebody else, right? You've stolen or you've injured or something like that. Then you bring your sin offering and you bring restitution plus 20%, right? So you restore that person. So this is a guilt offering when this is not a private thing. This is not something that is maybe a personal slight where I need to bring a sin offering. This is something where is cost somebody. All right, and then chapter 8 through 10, we saw the ordination of the priest, and that's where we left off last time. So I'm sorry about that I didn't go over
That's okay.
what we were going to cover. Yes, sir. So chapter 11, I think, is what we're ready for. Is that where you were ready to go? Okay, great.
In chapter 11, God expected His people to be holy, and He set rules for them to follow, and they had to follow these rules in order to be pleasing to Him. And look at chapter 11. Well, just look at the last. Let's see in verse 43 and 44. 44. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore consecrate yourselves, and you shall be holy, for I am holy. Neither shall you defile yourselves with any creeping thing that creeps on the earth. But what I see there is they had to be holy, and in order to be holy, they had to keep His laws. And of course, His laws were quite a bit cumbersome, you might say. There was a lot of details that they had to follow and keep up with, and of course the priest would help them in that. But in chapter 11, there's a lot of things listed that they could eat and couldn't eat, and there were foods that were clean and they were allowed to eat, but also there were foods that were forbidden to eat. And if you look at some of the clean animals in verse 2 and 3, speak to the children of Israel, saying, these are the animals which you may eat among all the animals that are on earth. Among the animals, whatever divides the hoof, having cloven hooves, and chewing the cud, that you may eat. And so animals that had cloven hooves and chewed the cud. I went over this. I taught Addie and Ella a little bit about this, Lucas, chewing the cud. I asked them if they knew what that meant, and they said no. But anyway, an animal that chews the cud is like cows, deer, sheep, goats, and then even antelope. Those are the type of animals that they could eat. Chewing the cud, of course, is they're ruminators, you might say. The ruminant animals, they have chambers in their stomach where if they and there's really no need to go into all that, but I read somewhere where a cow can normally chews cud 8 hours a day. And so when you sit around and you see cows eating all the time, that's what they're doing. But the unclean animals in verse 4 through 8, nevertheless, these you shall not eat among those that chew the cud, or those that have cloven hooves. The camel, because it chews the cud, but does not have cloven hooves, is unclean to you. The rock hyrax, because it chews the cud and does not have cloven, is unclean to you. The hare, because it but does not have cloven hooves, is unclean to you. And the swine, though it divides the hoof, having cloven hooves, yet does not chew the cud, is unclean to you. And so those are the type animals that they could not eat. Look at verse 9 now. These you may eat of all that are in the water. Whatever in the water has fins and scales, whether in the seas or in the rivers, that you may eat. So they could eat fish with fins and scales. And in verse 10, but all in the seas or in the rivers that do not have fins and scales, all that move in the water or any living thing which is in the water, they are an abomination to you. So what would be a type of animal or fish without fins or scales? Catfish. That's the one I thought of too, right off the bat. Um, Sharks. Mm-hmm. But
Dolphins, yeah, any kind of shellfish, I think.
Yes, right. Yes.
Shrimp.
But look in verse 13. And these you shall regard as an abomination among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. The eagle, the vulture, the buzzard, the kite, and the falcon after its kind, every raven after its kind, the ostrich, the short-eared owl, the seagull, and the hawk after its kind, the little owl, the fisher owl, the screech owl, the white owl, the jackdaw, and the carrion vulture, the stork, the heron, after its kind, the hoopie, whatever that's, and the bat. So these were unclean birds. He talks also about some verse 20 through 23 there. All flying insects that creep on all fours of the ocean. Yet you may eat of every flying insect that creeps on all fours, those which have jointed legs above their feet, with which to leap on the earth. But he goes on and talks about the clean and unclean insects there. There's some that they could eat and some that they couldn't eat. Now look down in verse 24. By these ye shall become unclean. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them shall be unclean until evening. So if you touched the dead one of these that had died, that would make you unclean also. Look in verse 29. Unclean to you among creeping things that creep on the earth, the mole, the mouse, the large lizard, after its kind, the gecko, the monitor lizard, the sand reptile, the sand lizard, and the chameleon. Notice that those were things that would defile them. But in verse 44 through 47, I would like to read that. For I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore consecrate yourselves, and you shall be holy, for I am holy. Neither shall you defile yourselves with any creeping thing that creeps on the earth. For I am the Lord who brings you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. Well, there's a lot of things there that they had to keep up with, but I'm sure after a while they would get used to that. But today, how does that contrast with the new law, our law today?
When I can't remember if it was Paul, he wouldn't go to the 1,000, and he said that he could eat these, and there was a drink of animals lowered down to it, that the Lord told him, if you bless what you're about to eat, that you can eat all this that used to be unclean because you're under a new covenant of Christ. You're not under the old law.
Right, there's nothing to be refused anymore, right? Paul said in 1 Timothy 4:4, every creature of God is good and nothing to be refused. So aren't you thankful? We can eat bacon, right? But we ought to be very thankful that we live under a better law that's not nearly as complicated and cumbersome as they did.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
That's right. So on my chart up here, my air one is wrong. The birds, if it's on the list, it is not clean. My chart that I'm looking at on my thing here is right. That one's not. So if it's on the list, it's not clean. But that doesn't matter because you don't live under the old law. So don't worry about it. But I do want to notice one passage over in Leviticus 20 that has to do with this. I know we're kind of going through in a sequential order, but somebody might ask, why make these rules about clean and unclean animals? And I don't know why specific animals were chosen. Right? There would be some animals that we'd say, yeah, I wouldn't want to eat that either, right? But then there would be others that we would say, what's the difference in that and eating this? I think maybe the pig would be the one where we would say, what's the distinction there that we're making? Some of these animals are like predatory or cleanup animals, right? Especially the birds. A lot of them are cleanup animals. I think they just had the impression of them was that they were dirty and gross, and I think God is saying you need to avoid that. Some of these are associated with death, things like that. Now, I don't know if that's the significance of all of them, but the significance in general in Leviticus 20 and in verse 25, he says, you are therefore to make a distinction between the clean animal and the unclean, and between the unclean bird and the clean, and you shall not make yourselves detestable by animal or by bird or by anything that creeps on the ground, which I have separated for you as unclean. Thus you are to be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and I have set you apart from the peoples to be mine. The reason that they had to distinguish between clean and unclean animals, God says here, is because I have distinguished you from the peoples. Now, again, why these specific animals? I don't know. But in general, it was because they were supposed to be a distinct people. And every day when they sit down to eat, they are reminded of that distinctiveness. Right? They are reminded of the fact that God has separated us out from peoples. Well, what better way to inscribe that on their minds, to remind them of that, than to say, hey, even when you sit down at the table, you can't just eat anything because you're special and you've been distinguished. Now, I believe that Peter has this in mind when he goes in Acts 10 to Cornelius' house. Because in Acts chapter 10, and we won't take the time to look at the text, I know you know that well. So Peter sees this vision, what God has cleansed, you don't call common. Now, there's not a place where God ever says, oh yeah, by the way, Peter, I'm talking about people, not just animals. But in Acts chapter 10, and I will flip over to this passage, Acts chapter 10 and verse 28, Peter says, you yourselves know how unlawful it is for a man who is a Jew to associate with a foreigner or to visit him, and yet God has shown me that I should not call any man unholy or unclean. And you might say, well, I didn't read that part. No, you didn't. All he showed him was to the animals. There was no clean or unclean. But Peter knew his Bible well. And Peter knew that if there was no longer a distinction to be made between animals, it meant there was no longer a distinction to be made between people. That's the logical conclusion from what God had said. If I don't have to distinguish between a cow and a pig anymore, that means I don't have to distinguish between a Jew and a Gentile anymore. And that's a powerful connection that Peter's able to make. And it just shows us the power of a logical conclusion, what we sometimes call necessary inference. Peter's just putting all these factors together. So, anyway, maybe this chart is helpful except for the fact that it's wrong. So just overlook that.
Well, just like you said, when God separated what they could eat, the world as a whole ate everybody.
Yes.
And if you were a child of God under the Jews,
yes,
and you done what the commandment was, you couldn't do what everybody else did.
Right. Yeah.
And that's which made them a special people.
Yeah, I think many of the laws that are given to us that seem to be, so for example, not being allowed to mix fabrics or not being able to plant different kinds of seed altogether, I think all of that was teaching them a lesson about distinctions that need to be made. Now, in one sense, we still carry those lessons over. We still have to make a distinction. But it's not about what goes into the mouth, Jesus says, Mark 7. It's about what comes out of our hearts. And that's where we have to be concerned about what's clean and unclean, what's holy and unholy. And so it's not about the clean or unclean food that goes in. It's about what comes out of our hearts and our minds that now we're concerned about. So in Mark 7, I think that's where Mark gives us kind of the parenthetical statement. This he said, thus making all things clean. I think basically this rule was already being done away with even before Jesus dies because he's pointing forward to what this was pointing forward to all along. All right. Anyway, anything else on all that? Go ahead.
No.
You guys?
We can debate why he, made certain foods clean.
Yes.
But bottom line is he's setting boundaries.
Yes.
And are people going to follow him?
Yeah.
That's what's going to make them stick.
Yes.
That's the reality of the whole point of all this is, will they follow what he says?
Yeah.
Will they obey him? You know, this is about teaching them about sin. And these are the kind of lessons that they're going to learn, the nature of sin.
Yeah.
They can learn it from maybe a distance, or they can get very intimate and, you know, participate in it.
Yes.
They're going to learn that what, you know, if they obey God, then, you know, they're going to be good. But when they don't, it's going to be very costly.
Yeah. That's right. Very good. All right. Anything else? All right. So the next several chapters have to do with purifications after certain events take place. Let me just say something about all of these in general before we say anything specifically. I don't think in any of these that what we're talking about is something that is sinful, right? So the purification that has to take place after childbirth, or in this case, after intercourse or menstruation or anything like that, I don't think what we're talking about is, in fact, I'm quite confident that this is true. What we're not talking about is something that is atoning for some sin that was committed. Rather, it's about ritual purity. It's about cleanliness. It's teaching about separation from, from things that would just be defiling in general. Now, we might wonder why these certain things are specified. Well, in many of these cases, we're talking about things that are associated with blood or with human fluids, and there is a line that is drawn. When you come in contact with these things, there's a process you have to go through to be clean again, at least clean enough to come into God's presence, at least clean enough to be able to involve yourself in God's things. With leprosy, the cleanness and the separation is about the safety of the community, right? These are contagions that could spread. And so basically this process was to keep these kind of skin disorders from just running rampant through a community. And really, it seems to me that, I know the Bible is not a science textbook, but it seems to be cutting edge before there's any germ theory of disease to say, hey, we have noticed, God sees that these kinds of things spread, and so let's separate these people out. Let's quarantine, to use a bad word we learned over the last couple of years. Let's quarantine these people in order to prevent the continual spread. But I do think it's teaching about separation. The reason I want to point that out about not being sinful, there are folks who will point to the fact that a woman had to offer sacrifices after she gave birth as a defense of the idea that children are born in sin. Well, the sacrifice wasn't for the child, it was for the mother, right? And childbirth is not sinful. And being born is not sinful, by the way. Rather, it's about purification. It's about being clean in a ritual sense before God. And maybe there are moral lessons that this teaches, but I think we ought to be careful about saying this is because they've done something sinful. This would apply to married couples, or if you're a non-married couple and you're involved in the things of chapter 15, then you got more problems, right? But anyway, so anything you would like to say about those specific chapters? Chapter 12, 13, 14? Yeah. Chapter 12?
No.
Okay. So there's a lot of details that I typed out, but I don't want to read all that. So you can go back and that's pretty much just Leviticus 13, 14. And 15. Now, 15:31 through 33, I think is helpful. 15:31 through 33. He says, "Thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle that is in their midst." And so then he describes that. Continue. So basically, this is just about what we would call ritual purity. Let me go back to the case here with childbirth in chapter 12. You remember that in this case, what you would do is you would offer a lamb for a burnt offering, or a pigeon or a dove for a sin offering. And then the poor woman could offer 2 pigeons or 2 doves, one for the burnt and one for the sin offering. Now, why do you think that's significant? Where do we read of somebody bringing 2 turtle doves as their offering? Mary and Joseph bring 2 turtle doves to be offered at the temple for her purification. This is in Luke chapter 2. Now, what that tells us is that Mary and Joseph fell into this latter category of people. They were impoverished. Now, do you notice that for the most part, you could not offer a wild animal as a sacrifice, right? You couldn't go catch an antelope. It was clean to eat, but it was not holy to sacrifice. I don't know all the reasons for that. One of the reasons is because there's not the same financial commitment that's made when you just go catch a wild animal and bring it as it would be to take the best of your lambs and bring that. Quite the commitment. I think that this offering the birds is maybe a partial exception to that. I guess you could have a turtle dove production facility, but I don't think that would have been typical. I think you probably would have caught these. And I think that's why it's the provision for the poor people. So they're still making a sacrifice, but it would not be a financial burden. They would be able. So I know the Bible kind of gets a tough treatment about its treatment of the oppressed and the marginalized, things like that. Well, people who think that the Bible is not for oppressed and marginalized people haven't read their Bible. Right? Because all the way through, God is aware that people may not have, that they may be poor. And He's put safety and precautions and escape hatches all the way through for them in order to be able to still come and worship Him. So you don't get out of the sacrifice because you're poor, right? Well, I'm poor. I don't have to do. Oh, yeah, you do have to do something. But we're going to make it something that you can do. God doesn't expect of them something that they can't bring. And so I find that to be fascinating and comforting that God asks them, you got to sacrifice. But it's not the same sacrifice for everybody depending on their status. I don't know that I have much more to say about all that. Anything through 15 you'd like to say?
I'd like to go back a little bit to 13.
Yeah, please do.
We haven't talked about leprosy yet. And of course, that was a dreaded disease back in those days. And I noticed as I read through that, the way that they treated leprosy, you might say, is if a man had a sore come up or a white spot, then they would be suspicious. And the priest were to examine it. They would go to the priest and let him examine it. And he would look at it and he would say, well, this looks like we'll wait for 7 days to see if it gets worse. And I never could understand. Today, it's not near as bad of a disease because we have medical doctors that treat it. But I was just noticing that at this time, all they did was go to the priest, and he would look at it and watch it, and he would watch it, keep watching it. They would keep watching it, and I never got the idea anywhere in there that all they did, that's all, they did nothing but watch it really to see if it got worse. And if it got worse, then he would declare him a leper. But there was a chance that person could be healed. And if he was healed, then he had to be cleansed by the priest. And but him and the priest had to go outside the camp and to inspect it. They did not want leprosy inside the camp anywhere. And but if he was clean, then they would offer sacrifices in a certain way. That's covered in chapters 13 and 14. if a leper, they would examine their houses, their clothes, everything that they had touched. If anyone touched or came in contact with anything like that that they had contact with, then they were defiled too, and they would have to be cleansed themselves, and they would have to go through certain procedures. I noticed in one place, if a house, they would watch the house too, and if the disease spread in the house, they would tear the house down. And it was really interesting to see how they dealt with all those things. And if they had touched a vessel, it was to be broken. If it was a wooden vessel, it was to be washed. But when the person was healed, they would count 7 days, and then they would bathe in a spring and wash their clothes. And on the 8th day, they would make an offering, a sin offering and a burnt offering. But I just wanted to bring that up.
What you just talked about, and it's written here in Scripture, about how bad leprosy was. And then it must be known all the nations about how bad leprosy was. So when God sent Moses to Pharaoh and he could stick his hand in his coat and pull his hand and his arm out and it'd be leprous, and then turn around and stick it back in and then pull it out and it'd be healed. I mean, only God could heal the leprosy just immediately, because you see how much time that they had to go through under the description. If you had leprosy, to actually monitor it and make sure nobody actually touched it. So God used it before Pharaoh that, hey, Moses is from God because he could perform this same thing before the elders of the Israelites.
I take it back. They didn't have to offer a sin offering and a burnt offering after it, but they had to be declared clean or unclean. Another thing about a leper is, where did he live?
Outside of the old cow.
Right. And what was his, if he saw somebody, look in chapter 13 now, if a leper whom the sore is, his clothes shall be torn, his head bare, and he shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. I guess it would be like this right here. And now he shall be unclean all the days he has the sore, and he shall be unclean. But anyway, his dwelling shall be outside the camp at the end of verse 46 there.
Even when Christ actually healed the leper, he told him after he got healed, what should he do? And he said, you got to go and see the priest, but not to tell anyone.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to look at that story there where Jesus does heal the leper. This is at the end of Mark chapter 1. It's in other places too. But do you remember what the leper says to Jesus? He said, "Will." So he didn't out Jesus healed him, he just made out his. And Jesus reached out and touched him. Now, this is what happens to Jesus. He go through at least some part of this process in order to be as clean again. But what actually happens? He cleanses the leper. So I think you kind of have to know the book of Leviticus in order to appreciate what's happening in that story. Here is a man whose touch should have made Jesus clean, and Jesus cleanses him. That's typically not how things work, right? You can't touch, in the book of Leviticus, when an unclean thing touches a clean thing, it always makes the clean thing unclean. It never makes the clean thing, never makes the unclean thing clean, right? It doesn't flow that way until Jesus comes. Then the clean thing makes the unclean things clean. And basically, I think the picture here is here is the one who has the power to roll back uncleanness. Here's the one who has the power to roll back impurity. And that is a picture of what he intends to do, not just with skin diseases, but with soul diseases. He has the intention to roll back the impurity and the uncleanness, that he can do something about it, perhaps when other people cannot. And so I think, there's a couple of instances already in these pretty, like chapter 12, 13, 14, 15 of Leviticus. probably not many places less studied than that, right? And yet we've already seen something that this is telling us about who Jesus is. The fact that his mother came and offered 2 turtle doves. When he came, he didn't come to be treated as royalty. He came and stooped to its lowest point to be a servant for us. Leviticus 13 and 14 about the uncleanness of leprosy. We don't study these chapters very much. That's probably appropriate. But it tells us something about who Jesus is and his power to roll back this impurity. So anyway, I just say that to say that maybe it's hard on the front end to see the value of studying chapters like this. But when we see how Jesus fulfills the law, I think it helps us make our New Testament study even richer when we look at it. Okay. Anything on 15 you'd like to say? Me neither. You've read 15.
You say that the people, a lesson for the people were through this leprosy was, this is how you treat sin. You do not go near it, do not touch it. In fact, you cast it from your hand.
Yeah.
Cast it away from you, as far away from you as you can.
Yeah. I think there probably was a practical aspect to it as far as in like trying to avoid the spread of things. But I certainly think that's a lesson that is drawn from it. I think you're right there. Even when you look at other accounts, like the story of Naaman, right, which is a great story to teach how sin and how God's grace and obedience all work together, and leprosy is the culprit there. I think the Bible is using leprosy very often as a visible demonstration of a problem, obedience, cleansing, and all of that. I certainly think that's the way Jesus is using it in the miracle as a demonstration of what he's come to do spiritually. So yeah, I think that's a great point. Okay, so chapter 16. We really probably won't have time to cover all of this. But in Leviticus 16, we're talking about the Day of Atonement. And the Day of Atonement would be on the 10th day of the 7th month. And today, there is still some sort of celebration of the Day of Atonement. They can't celebrate it like they did in the Old Testament because there is no temple. But they know people call it today Yom Kippur. So if you hear people talking about Yom Kippur, they're talking about the Day of Atonement. Kippur is the Hebrew word for covering or atonement. And it is a beautiful ceremony. Not so beautiful for the goats, but it's beautiful for what it pictures, I think. So in chapter 16, we kind of get an outline for how this feast is supposed to go. And so on the 10th day of the 7th month, this day would be treated as a Sabbath, right? So you wouldn't do work on this day. It would be a set-aside rest day. And in verses 1 through 10, we kind of get an overview of what's happening. And if it's all right, I'll just take the time to read that, and then we may save our comments for next time. So this is in verse 2. Tell Aaron your brother not to come at any time into the holy place inside the veil. Sometimes this is what we call the most holy place, inside the veil. For before the mercy seat that is on the ark, so that he may not die, for I will appear in the cloud over the mercy seat. But in this way Aaron shall come to the holy place, with a bull from the herd for a sin offering, and a ram for a burnt offering. He shall put on the holy linen coat, shall have the linen undergarment on his body, and he shall tie the linen sash around his waist, and wear the linen turban. These are the holy garments. He shall bathe his body in water, and then put them on. And he shall take from the congregation of the people 2 male goats for a sin offering, and 1 ram for a burnt offering. Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. Then he shall take the 2 goats, and set them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And Aaron shall cast lots over the 2 goats, 1 lot for the Lord, and the other lot for Azazel. Does yours say the scapegoat there? Okay, good. And Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for the Lord, and use it as a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel, or for the sin the scapegoat, shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away into the wilderness to. And what does yours say? Mine says Azazel again. What word do you have there? At the very end of 10.
Scapegoat.
To the scapegoat. Okay. So, well, we're out of time. So we'll talk about that next time. How about that?
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.